So the plan for today is to take a look at employee conduct out with the workplace. We tend to do a refresher on this topic in December time because it ties in nicely with Christmas parties coming up, the festive season, and how we might deal with any situations or problems that arise in the course of these kind of festive outings. So a very topical one, hence the Christmas jumper as well for our December breakfast briefing. In terms of the agenda for this morning, it's a short session, but I've tried to fit a good amount in for us. So we'll start off just with a look at the law on misconduct out of work, so what the legal framework is on it. Conscious that that will involve going through a little bit of the provision within the Employment Rights Act, and it's a bit early for that. So we will look at some examples from cases, because I think the best way to see it in action is just to look at previous cases and how they were decided in the Employment Tribunal. And the cases that I've picked out focus on employee misconduct out of work, but I've also found a couple that do feature conduct that took place at a Christmas event. We'll then have a quick look at criminal offences and how they might impact when it might be appropriate to take disciplinary action for a criminal offence that more often would have taken place outside of working time. One change from last year's session is that we now have the positive duty to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, which can also extend outside of the workplace if there's like a connection to work. So have a look at how you might take proactive steps to stop any sort of sexual harassment taking place at these types of events, because that's now a legal duty on employers. And then we'll just end on some tips that we can take from all of this and how we should manage kind of Christmas functions. So a lot to get through this morning. So just a quick recap on the law. When we're speaking about misconduct outside of the workplace, conduct is a potentially fair reason to dismiss someone, and that's within Section 98 of the Employment Rights Act. So when we are going through a disciplinary process and there's a dismissal thereafter, an employer will usually be relying on conduct as the potentially fair reason for that dismissal. And conduct can extend to conduct that takes place out of work. It's not limited just to conduct that happens on the employer's premises or in working time. And I've taken a quote there that's lifted straight from an employment tribunal case that sets the kind of precedence on this. And it says it can extend to conduct out of work so long as in some respect or other it affects the employee or could be thought to affect the employee when they're doing their work. So really we're looking for that conduct out of work to have some sort of link or some sort of impact on the workplace, how they carry out their duties. And what we'll do this morning is we'll have a look at some cases to find, when a tribunal has accepted that there's been enough of a connection for an employer to actually go ahead and take action on something that's happened out of the workplace. And as always, the kind of test for whether or not an employer would be fair in dismissing someone for that conduct, they would have to show that that conduct out of work was the reason for the dismissal, but also that they acted reasonably when they were carrying, and treating that as the reason. So that'll be things like following a fair procedure, following your disciplinary process, but we'll also look at how, you make sure that you've acted fairly substantively. So the types of things you should consider when you might be investigating misconduct that's taken place outside of work. So we'll just get straight into some examples now, and then we'll come back to this at the end and discuss the kind of key takeaways from these cases. So the first case I've got on screen there is the case of Codner against Virgin Media Limited. And in this case, it was a female employee who was dismissed off the back of a company Christmas party. And at that Christmas party, there was complaints about kind of racially offensive and sexually charged language towards colleagues. And there was also a complaint from a male colleague about sexual behaviour and sexual harassment from her towards him. So off the back of that, a process was commenced and ultimately she was dismissed. She raised a claim to the tribunal for unfair dismissal, but ultimately that claim was rejected. And the kind of reasoning behind that, any argument that this took place out of work was struck down because this was an official company event, and had a direct link to relationships. So as you can imagine, even though this took place at a party, not at work, that's going to directly impact when everyone comes back to work on the Monday. That's certainly going to damage relationships, make have an impact on people emotionally. So there's that sufficient link to have taken action. And later on as well, we'll take a look at unofficial v official company nights out and what that means.
Amy, sorry to interrupt. We've got someone with their hand up. Mandy,
But
I think it is.
I think that was just to let me know that the
Right.
slides were on. If it's not Mandy, you can let me know.
No, it was. I pressed the wrong one. That was to let you know the slides.
I thought that, don't worry. Thanks, Debbie. Oh, and you're very festive, Debbie. Keep yourself on.
Is there a surprise about that?
The next case is Gimson against Display by Design. A slightly different case here. This actually involved physical violence. So it was an employee who hit another colleague in the face, and they caused serious injury. So, potential criminal element there as well. But this didn't actually take place at the company party. It took place in the street whilst they were walking home from the company Christmas party. So again, a process was commenced, the person was dismissed for gross misconduct, and they raised a claim of unfair dismissal to the employment tribunal. And again, in this case, any arguments that it was inappropriate for an employer to have taken action because it was outside of work, there wasn't that link, were rejected. Because although this took place, in the street, it was like a direct result of the Christmas party having happened. These people wouldn't have been together, wouldn't have been in the street, wouldn't have been, intoxicated had they not been at that Christmas party. So they said that was sufficiently connected to work. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. So, even if it's not at the party, they were seeing something happen in the street and there was still that link. And the last one, I spoke about this case before, but I think again, this one's useful to get our heads around it because this one doesn't even feature a Christmas party or a company event. This is just straight up misconduct that's happened outside of work and outside of working hours. So it was essentially two employees that were in some sort of domestic dispute. So from having read the judgment, if I remember rightly, it was about someone's girlfriend. I think there might have been a bit of drama there. And it happened in a car park across the road from the site. And it also happened out with both their working hours. Again, that person was taken through a process. Someone was dismissed, raised a claim of unfair dismissal off the back of that. But again, that link was established in that case, and the tribunal agreed that the employer could deal with this through the disciplinary process. Because although it didn't happen on site, it happened across the road. That conduct clearly had a link to how they could come back in and carry out their duties because the other employee didn't feel safe at work. Comments from the tribunal are at the bottom there. It was irrelevant, it was a domestic matter. Any arguments that the employee put forth that, because this is domestic, it shouldn't be dealt with by an employer were rejected. They said that what had happened was sufficient to breach the employer's trust and confidence. So another interesting one, because that's conduct, not even at a company official event, out in the street, and it was sufficient to have taken action. So in terms of just key takeaways from the cases that I've just taken us through fairly quickly, I think what hopefully you can see from that is that the misconduct needs to relate to the employment. It needs to have some sort of relevance to the business, how they'll carry out the role, impact the workplace. To be able to initiate your disciplinary process, you need to know what that link is and be able to kind of justify that a link is there. Just to pick an example, you know, say an employee was out at the pub on a Saturday night, not with colleagues, got into some sort of brawl, you know, whether or not there's some sort of charge from that in a street fight, you know, you get wind of that. If that employee isn't in a role that works, you know, in a regulated profession, or, you know, if children or vulnerable adults, you know, there's not colleagues involved, it's in their own time, you can see how there, with, you know, different circumstances, it might be hard to justify in that instance taking disciplinary action because there's so many factors that distance it from work. There's arguably not as strong a link there. It will always be very fact specific. So I think that's why it's important that when you do an investigation into these types of allegations, you really investigate all of those types of things, the full context. So, you know, the seniority of the individual, are they in a regulated profession? For example, I'm a solicitor, so I'm subscribed to a whole set of ethical rules that my role's contingent on, similar for people who maybe work in the care sector. What type of work do they do? So, you know, are they working, you know, in finance, and there's something that would, you know, has there been dishonesty? All of these types of things. Again, because it is fact specific, it's not a bad one to take advice on. If you know you ever are in a situation where you're not sure if it's appropriate to deal with through company procedures. And I think investigation here is key. And in your investigation, you'll include whether, you know, information on why it's been dealt with through the company procedure. Things could be, you know, if it's happened at an event, how did the event come about? Is it an official event, unofficial? How was it organised? What's the impact of the incident? What might, you know, flow from it into the workplace? Is there fear, animosity between colleagues? Another thing that I commonly come across is there being an element of kind of damage to reputation off the back of conduct outside of work. We'll speak about that again in the context of kind of criminal offences. But if you are relying on any sort of damage or reputation to the business in a disciplinary procedure because of this conduct, what's come out of case law and what's really key to this is that it can't just be, you know, a fear of damage to reputation or perceived damage. It needs to actually be evidenced and tangible damage to reputation. So, you know, can you show that a customer has raised this to you? You know, a stakeholder, someone that you work with closely, has raised the issue to you. Someone, you know, refusing to contract with you, or employees refusing to come to work. You need to actually be able to show that it's damaged your reputation. Have you lost business? You can't just, it wouldn't be enough to show, you know, we're just concerned that we might have a damage to reputation. That often comes up in like the social media cases as well. You've maybe heard of the cases in the past where an employee's put something wild on social media out of their own time, on their own time, on their own personal page. And again, that would be looking at things like how many people seen the post? Was it public? Was it private? So actually really investigating the kind of damage to reputation piece. And as always, you should consider sanctions short of dismissal. So, you know, considering whether this is something that could be addressed, perhaps with like a final written warning, but clear expectations being set of what you expect going forward. Sometimes it might be that you consider those sanctions, but it's still appropriate to dismiss. But you always want to be able to show that you have considered penalties less than dismissal before making that decision. I wanted to just do a quick note on criminal offences. This will be quite brief, just given the time, but what I will say is ACAS, you've probably heard of like the ACAS statutory code. There's also like an ACAS non-statutory guidance, which is much, much longer. They have a very good section on dealing with disciplinaries with a criminal element, and it's one that you tend to find people don't know exists. So if you're ever want to do a bit of extra reading or get some kind of valuable and trusted information on this, that's a good one to have a read at. So criminal offences that an employee commits will usually take place outside of work, and there could be scenarios where it is appropriate to take disciplinary action. But again, we need to be able to show that it's going to have an impact or a link to employment. So I think again that can be much easier if someone is in a role that directly is impacted by the criminal charge or the criminal conviction that they've received. You know, say it's someone who does work with vulnerable adults, children, you know, and they have some sort of criminal conviction of a sexual nature, you can see how that directly impacts. Similarly, if you have someone in a position who deals with, you know, finances and they have like a criminal fraud charge, you can see how that has a direct link. Looking at the ACAS guidance, there might be some scenarios where if you find out someone has been charged with a criminal offence, it's appropriate to suspend your disciplinary process to wait on the outcome of the criminal investigation, the criminal proceedings, and then resume when you know whether or not, you know, they're actually guilty of the crime they've been charged with. But some of these charges, they do span, you know, they could span over a year. It might be that, you know, you can't wait that long to find the resolution of the criminal process before taking action, in which case that ACAS guidance certainly suggests that you know, have justification for having to move forward and that you do as much investigation as is possible at that point in time with the information available. Another one actually that I've been asked before is if there's a criminal process, do we need to do a disciplinary process? And the answer is yes, and that's just because employment law sits separately to criminal law. So you could be doing your disciplinary process alongside whatever criminal investigation the police is doing. I think another interesting point just to bring to your attention on the criminal offence front is that there is really no blanket requirement in law for an employee to let you know that they've had a criminal charge or caution. This would really be in very specific industries, regulated industries, that they have to inform. But out with that, unless you have something in your contract that requires them to inform you on an ongoing basis, you know, they actually don't have to tell you about a criminal charge or caution. So that's one that people always find quite interesting. And another point that kind of flows from that is that sometimes, you know, if you're a HR professional or you know, a manager, owner of a business, sometimes you might catch wind of a criminal conviction that's very morally challenging. You know, so I've heard of it being found out that employees have, you know, crimes of a sexual nature, even crimes involving children, and that can really challenge you morally. But the way that the law is structured is that that's not automatically a reason to dismiss someone. The kind of way it's structured is that they've already received their punishment in the criminal law, so there's no automatic thing that flows from that they should lose their job. So it's just about, you know, still going through that process, still investigating to see, you know, if there's a link, if it's appropriate to deal with your disciplinary process as a conduct matter. I've put at the bottom there it could potentially result in a SOSR dismissal. That's a dismissal not for conduct, not for a disciplinary issue, but some other substantial reason. And where we've seen that kick in is, you know, if something's, say, been in the paper about a criminal charge and it causes outrage in the workforce among other employees, then, you know, it might be a some other substantial reason situation. If you're worried that if this person turns up to your premises, you know, there could be a health and safety issue with fighting, or people are just point blank refusing to work with that individual. You know, they're saying if they come back to work, we're all going to walk out, we're not working. That might mean you've got enough to show that you've got a case for an SOSR dismissal, but that would sit separately to relying on conduct. You would still need to go through a full disciplinary procedure for that. I'll take us through just a bit about sexual harassment, and how this links to the new positive duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment from taking place. So just as a quick refresher, when we speak about sexual harassment, I've put the statutory definition on the screen. It needs to be unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, and it needs to have the purpose or effect of violating integrity, or creating a intimidating, offensive, hostile, degrading or humiliating environment. So that's taken straight from the Equality Act. I've put just examples of what forms that might take. So it could be physical, inappropriate touching. It could also be, you know, sexually explicit jokes, showing pornographic imagery. It could be invasion of personal space, persistent sexual advantages, all of these types of things. And the key point is just that this can extend to work-related events or environments, even if it doesn't take place solely in the workplace. Similar to what we've discussed before this morning, you know, you could still be liable for, the company could still be liable for a sexual harassment complaint if any of this takes place at, you know, say for example, a works Christmas party or any sort of kind of employee night out. So this is more important kind of this year than ever, because from October 2024, we've seen the new legal duty on employers to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace coming into full swing. And now that that's been out for a while, we've got a kind of good idea of what that involves and what's expected from employers. We've covered this in previous sessions, but just as a recap, the kind of key things are having a policy in place that clearly defines what sexual harassment is, that's available to your employees, and that has clear reporting procedures so that an employee knows where to go and how to report it. And also it's recommended that there's perhaps multiple reporting procedures. So, you know, more than one way to report it if someone, for example, you know, doesn't feel confident in raising it, and, you know, wants to do so anonymously or to a different person, that there's options there. The key one, and I know this because I think I've been out 6 times in the last 3 weeks doing training on this, is making sure that your employees have regular training on this issue. So what it is, how they report it, and that should be conducted regularly. Right now we don't have like a solid definition of what regularly is, but I think we're taking it to be kind of annually. So annual training on this, what sexual harassment is, how to report it, these types of things. And another one that's very topical to the kind of Christmas party context is that employers should have a sexual harassment risk assessment in place. So the EHRC code on all of this says that that's one of the steps we need to do to be able to show we're taking steps to prevent it. We have a template available for member companies. If anyone doesn't have one, get in touch and we can get that to you, and you can tweak it and implement it. But it's basically about identifying scenarios, situations where sexual harassment could occur, and, you know, recording what the mitigations and what is in place to reduce that from happening. And another one is just monitoring and reviewing how effective your measures are on an ongoing basis. So that could be through things like employee surveys, and tracking it that way. I know other employers are making sure they're keeping records and data on how many complaints they're having of this nature, so they can track our complaints reducing, increasing, things like that. We'll come back to the sexual harassment risk assessment point in a minute. So based on everything we've discussed there, you'll probably gather that any sort of kind of Christmas festive work parties do hold increased employment law risks. And that's because they're often considered an extension of the workplace, and employers can therefore be held vicariously liable for the actions of their employee that happen in that workplace. I said earlier I would touch on unofficial v official night out, and I think what's key there is to have in mind that even if it's not a night out that, you know, the company has organised, has paid for, has arranged, even if it's a night out arranged by a grouping of employees without kind of management approval, it could still have that link. It could still have that impact. That means that, you know, there is a risk there for employers, whether that be in the disciplinary sense or on the kind of sexual harassment front. So it doesn't actually matter, you know, all the time if it's an official v unofficial night out. There could be liability at both. And in terms of ways just to kind of mitigate that risk, some tips are on the screen there, and you'll get a copy of these slides. So I've put a bit of extra detail in this one for you. But I think key one is that before you have the night, just communicate what the standards are, what the expectations are, reminding people, you know, that either it's a company event or that your policies still apply. Communicating, you know, what behaviour is expected. That could be just from a group email before the night out. And again, I've seen some employers actually adopt this into policies. So having something in their handbook that says what the expectations are at work events, especially the kind of rules involving alcohol. You could have a statement in a handbook about that as well. But either way, I think it's still good to send something out to employees before the night out. And providing a safe environment and considering the new legal duty to prevent sexual harassment go hand in hand, because if you've got a sexual harassment risk assessment in place, one of the things you will risk assess is company functions, and that's because there's just inherently more risk because there's alcohol involved, you know, people might be intoxicated. So I would make sure that you actually do risk assess that and have a think about how you can you know, reduce risk of anything happening, whether that be misconduct or any sort of unlawful harassment. That might be having plans to get employees home. Are you limiting? Is it an open bar all night? Or is there a limit on the amount of free booze that's on offer? Making sure beforehand that you put out your policies so people know how to report things. And you could even let people know if something happens on the night, this is what we want you to do, this is how we want you to report it, this is who to report it to. And just about taking action, both on the misconduct and harassment front. If something does happen on one of these nights out and you catch wind, I would just make sure you investigate it fully using, you know, the correct company procedure. Fully investigate it and take action on that. So that was a very quick, well, I finished on the dot, 8:30 on the dot. I'm happy with that. That was a really quick refresher. I know we've done this one before. If anyone